Let me tell you something about silence. Silence is powerful. Silence is uncomfortable. And when you stop chasing a man, when you stop calling, when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop trying to fix what he broke, that silence becomes loud. See, most people think talking is power. No. Control is power. Discipline is power. And when you decide you're not going to beg for attention, not going to argue for respect, not going to compete for a position, that's already yours. That's when the shift happens. A man will ignore noise. He'll tune out complaints. He'll dodge long emotional messages. But what he cannot ignore is absence. When you go quiet, he feels it. He starts wondering, why isn't she calling? Why isn't she texting? Why isn't she reacting? And that curiosity turns into reflection. Reflection turns into pressure. And pressure makes people tell the truth. See, when you were always available, he didn't have to evaluate anything. He knew you'd be there. He knew you'd answer. He knew you'd forgive. But the moment you decide your peace is more important than proving a point, the game changes. Silence forces accountability because now he has space to hear his own thoughts. And a lot of times a man already knows he messed up. He just doesn't feel the urgency to fix it while you're still standing there, holding the relationship together by yourself. When you finally decide to stop talking, stop explaining, stop defending yourself over and over again, something shifts inside you that most people don't understand until they experience it. The silence you choose is not weakness, it's not surrender, and it's definitely not giving up. It's control. And the moment you take control of your emotions instead of letting your emotions control you, the entire dynamic between you and him begins to change without you saying a single word. Because up until now, he's been used to your reactions. He's been used to you asking questions, trying to fix things, reaching out first, or trying to make sense of his confusing behavior. He became comfortable knowing that no matter what happened, eventually you would break the silence. Eventually you would call. Eventually you would send that long message trying to clear everything up. But this time you didn't. And now the silence becomes louder than any argument you could have ever had. Because when there's no noise to distract him, no emotional conversation to escape into, no blame game to play, he's left alone with his own thoughts. And that's where reflection begins. Now he starts thinking about the last conversation you had. He replays your words in his head. He starts remembering the way you looked at him when you were hurt, the things he dismissed, the effort he took for granted, the boundaries he crossed, thinking there would be no real consequences. At first, he might tell himself you're just busy or that you'll come back around like you always do. But as time passes and your silence remains consistent, doubt begins to creep in. He notices your absence in small ways. The lack of your messages in the morning. The fact that your name isn't lighting up his phone anymore. The way his day feels just a little bit different without your presence checking in, supporting him, or even arguing with him. Because even conflict is a form of connection. And now that connection is gone. And with that absence comes curiosity. Why hasn't she said anything? Why isn't she reacting? Why does it feel like she's actually okay without me? And that question alone begins to create pressure inside him. Pressure that builds quietly, day by day, because now he realizes something he didn't have to think about before. Access to you was never guaranteed. He assumed your patience was permanent. He thought your understanding had no limits. He believed that no matter how distant he became or how careless his actions were, you would still be there waiting to talk it out. But your silence is telling him something words never could. It's telling him that your peace matters more than proving a point, that your dignity matters more than winning an argument, that you're no longer willing to fight for clarity from someone who should have given it willingly. And when a man is faced with the possibility that he may have actually lost someone who brought consistency, care, and emotional safety into his life, the truth becomes harder to avoid, because now he's forced to evaluate his own behavior without your voice interrupting his conscience. He starts to see where he could have done better, where he was unfair, where he avoided responsibility, and slowly that reflection turns into realization. Realization turns into urgency. And urgency eventually leads him right back to you. Not because you chased him, not because you demanded answers, but because your silence made him confront everything he was trying to ignore. There comes a moment when you realize that repeating yourself is no longer helping anything grow. It's only keeping a broken cycle alive. You've explained how you felt more than once. You've tried to be patient. You've given him opportunities to understand your perspective, to meet you halfway, to acknowledge the impact of his actions. But instead of change, you were met with excuses, deflection, or temporary effort that faded the moment things became comfortable again. And that's when something inside you begins to wake up. You start understanding that constantly speaking up in a place where you're not being heard isn't communication anymore, it's self-abandonment. So you stop, not because you don't care, but because you care about yourself enough to stop pouring energy into a space that keeps draining you. You decide that you're no longer going to remind someone of your worth, no longer going to argue for honesty, no longer going to beg for the kind of consistency that should come naturally from someone who values you. And once you make that decision, the silence that follows is not empty. It's intentional, it's protective, it's necessary. At first, he might feel relieved. The tension is gone. The questions have stopped. There's no pressure to respond to emotional conversations or to explain himself in uncomfortable ways. He might even convince himself that things are better this way, that the quiet means peace. But peace built on avoidance never lasts, because what he's actually experiencing is distance, and distance has a way of revealing truths that closeness can hide. He begins to notice the shift in your energy even without hearing from you. The social media activity that no longer revolves around him. The way mutual conversations don't mention your name anymore. The absence of your emotional presence in his daily routine. And slowly, the realization settles in that still, we're not just quiet, you're moving differently. You're living without waiting for him to get it together. And that's when his assumptions start to break down. He thought you needed closure from him to move forward. He believed your silence would eventually crack under the weight of unanswered questions. But instead, you found your own clarity. You stopped needing validation from someone who refused to give it. And as he starts to see that you are not chasing after explanations anymore, he begins to feel something unfamiliar, uncertainty about where he stands with you now. Because when you were constantly present, constantly communicating, he never had to wonder if you were still invested. Your effort reassured him that no matter how complicated things got, you were still emotionally attached. But now there's no reassurance, no emotional safety net, just silence that forces him to confront the possibility that you are emotionally detached in a way that may not be reversible. that thought lingers longer than he expects. He replays the last few interactions you had, looking for signs he may have missed. He questions whether he underestimated your boundaries. He starts to think about the conversations he avoided, the truths he postponed, the apologies he never fully delivered. And with each passing day that you remain silent, those thoughts grow heavier. Because now, the only way to release that pressure is through honesty. When you start prioritizing your own peace over someone else's approval, the dynamic of any relationship begins to shift in ways most people don't anticipate. People often confuse silence with weakness, thinking that if someone isn't speaking, they've lost interest or given up entirely. But in reality, silence can be one of the strongest forms of communication there is, especially when it comes from a place of self-respect. When you stop reacting to every inconsistency, stop defending yourself against every misstep, and stop trying to convince someone to value what they've been taken for granted, you're doing more than stepping back. You're creating space for clarity. And that clarity doesn't just affect you. It forces him to see what he's been ignoring all along. When you were constantly available, constantly explaining, constantly reacting, he never had to examine his own behavior. He could coast on the assumption that you'd always be there, that your love, your attention, and your patience were inexhaustible, and in some ways that's human nature. We often don't value what's easily accessible. It's only when the comfort of certainty is removed that people begin to realize the depth of what they've been overlooking. Your silence, your choice to stop filling the gaps with explanations creates a vacuum, and vacuums have a way of drawing out truths that were previously hidden or ignored. This is the moment where reflection begins. At first, he may feel nothing. He may even convince himself that your quietness is temporary or insignificant. He might distract himself with other things, keep himself busy, or rationalize that your absence from the conversation doesn't matter. But over time, the absence becomes noticeable. Small, seemingly insignificant patterns begin to emerge. He notices that you no longer text at the usual times. He realizes you're not reacting to his posts, not initiating conversations, not seeking him out like you used to. And these little details start to accumulate, creating an internal tension he can't easily shake off. As this tension grows, so does his awareness. He begins to ask himself questions he's avoided for weeks, months, maybe even years. Why isn't she responding? Why does it feel like she's moved on, even slightly? What did I do to create this distance? And as these questions settle in, he starts to reflect on his own actions. The missed calls, the forgotten promises, the dismissive comments, all of it starts to register in a new light. Where someone steps away without confrontation, without drama, without anger, it highlights accountability in a way that arguments never can. It's not loud, but it's undeniable. Eventually, that reflection turns into urgency. He realizes that he has allowed a connection that once mattered to slip through his fingers because he underestimated your presence, your patience, and your willingness to let him be himself without consequence. The truth becomes impossible to ignore. Your silence forces him to confront feelings, thoughts, and realizations he may have been avoiding for too long. He comes face to face with the fact that he has to take responsibility. And sometimes that responsibility manifests in a confession and honest acknowledgement of mistakes, wrong choices, or neglect. And here's the critical point. The confession doesn't happen because you demanded it, because you chased him, or because you manipulated the situation. It happens because silence, when paired with self-respect and consistency in your boundaries, creates a natural pressure that makes truth unavoidable. You didn't speak to force a reaction. You created space for him to understand the weight of his actions, the importance of your presence, and the value of integrity in a relationship. Your quietness becomes a mirror, reflecting not just what he did wrong, but also what he stood to lose if he didn't face it. Once he decides to admit the truth, it's because your silence awakens something inside him that words alone never could. It's the understanding that honesty is necessary, not just for him, but for the potential of what still could be. And that is why silence, when done intentionally and with self-respect, is more powerful than any argument, any pleading, or any explanation ever could be. When someone consistently takes your presence, patience, and care for granted, it slowly chips away at your energy and your sense of self. You start noticing patterns you once overlooked, small behaviors that signal disregard, moments of carelessness, and repeated excuses that show a lack of accountability. At first, it's subtle, and you try to ignore it. You rationalize. You convince yourself that people have flaws, that everyone makes mistakes, that love sometimes requires patience. But deep down, you know the difference between someone who truly values you and someone who only tolerates your existence until it's convenient. And eventually, that knowledge becomes impossible to ignore. That's when you make a decision to stop filling the space where respect should already exist, to stop arguing for acknowledgement, to stop trying to validate your own worth through his actions. The first step in this process is quieting your own voice, not because you no longer care, but because you realize your energy is too precious to spend on someone who refuses to take responsibility. Silence, in this sense, is not passive. It's active. It's intentional. You're no longer responding to messages that provoke frustration. You're no longer explaining feelings that he won't understand. You're no longer justifying your expectations to someone who should already meet them without a lecture. Instead, you step back, withdraw your emotional availability, and focus on maintaining your own equilibrium. And when you do this consistently, the shift is subtle but undeniable. You're no longer participating in a cycle that rewards neglect with your attention. You are reclaiming your own power. He begins to notice this change even if he doesn't immediately recognize it. Small things stand out. The lack of a quick reply, the absence of long explanatory messages, the fact that your emotional energy is no longer being offered freely. And while he may initially convince himself it doesn't matter, that silence is temporary, that you're just busy, eventually the lack of access starts to weigh on him. The same habits that once made him complacent, assuming you would always be available, that you would always forgive, that your love was limitless, now create a void. And humans are naturally wired to feel the absence of something they undervalued more than the presence of something they took for granted. As he confronts this absence, reflection begins. He replays conversations in his mind, rethinks decisions he made, and recalls opportunities to act differently that he neglected. What seemed minor before now looms large, because your silence has stripped away the distractions he used to justify his behavior. The quiet is forcing him to face the truth he didn't want to admit. He took you for granted. And now that you're not chasing, not pleading, not explaining, the consequences of his choices are tangible. He begins to understand the impact of his actions and the importance of your presence in ways he never considered while you were constantly available. This reflection builds pressure internally. He starts to feel urgency because he recognizes that the connection is fragile and not guaranteed. Your silence communicates boundaries without a single word, a statement louder than any argument you could have had. It's a signal that respect and accountability are non-negotiable. And as the pressure mounts, he begins to reassess not only his actions, but also his feelings. He realizes that avoiding the truth, delaying honesty, and dismissing your worth has left him facing potential loss, a loss he might not be able to recover from easily. Eventually, that pressure demands a response. Silence, when combined with consistency and self-respect, makes avoidance unsustainable. He can no longer pretend that everything is fine. Your absence forces acknowledgement, and acknowledgement leads to confession. Is not manipulation, it's the natural consequence of him confronting the reality that he jeopardized something valuable. When he finally reaches out, it isn't because you begged, it's because your quiet strength has shown him the seriousness of the situation, the weight of his mistakes, and the importance of honesty. Your silence becomes the catalyst for accountability, a mirror reflecting not just your worth, but also the consequences of ignoring it.